I wanted to talk about early transition as LARPing. I don't think about it anymore. I just go about my everyday life as a trans woman who doesn't pass and leave the worrying to the people around me. Most of the time, there's situations where I'm aware that I'm trying to persuade someone of the fiction that I'm a woman and that they should play their role in our interaction as if I was. And yet to me, I am a woman. I just know that. To them, I'm not and might never be. So I have to get them to suspend disbelief and go with their own fiction. It's a little bit uncanny. It feels like live action role play, only I'm not playing a role to myself, only to the other person. Although that makes it feel like a role to me when otherwise it isn't. Of course, early in transition, I didn't have this confidence in myself and indifference to the gender hangups of others. It all felt like role play. The seemingly natural performances I do now are a product of learning to play myself as a role and then forgetting that it's a role. And it's for anyone, as it is for anyone, more or less at home in their own skin. Like we forget that ourselves are kind of historical fabulations that we worked on. So in the metaphorical sense, there's a bleed, or there was. What was for a while live action role play in everyday life just became my everyday life. What was a role actually seems like just me now. Changing your gender as an adult is actually a good way to be reminded that what we take to be ourselves are roles that become habits. Sometimes transition is called second puberty, and usually people have hormones and stuff in mind and they say that. But I think it's more interesting to think about early transition as a puberty in the sense of learning a role and acting it out, or maybe more than one, until the role bleeds back into feeling like it isn't a role. Only sometimes the role playing is to avoid literal bleeding. My world is safer than that of most of my sisters. Most people don't give a shit about older women of any kind. You become invisible. And being white and middle class protects me, whether I like it or not. But there's still moments of danger, and not just from men. And if there's real danger, it's no longer a game. When there's the possibility of danger, it feels more like a role to me, though, performed intentionally to avoid violence. I can smile sweetly, dip my head or a shoulder, soften my voice, which usually I don't make any effort to change. I perform the things cis women do to appear like they're not a threat. Only I have to perform this for cis women too sometimes, who might be a threat to me because they imagine I'm a threat to them. But mostly I don't think about it anymore. I'm just a middle-aged transsexual woman going about her business. It's not really a role anymore, so get used to it. All right, that's all I wanted to throw in by way of an introductory text.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, yeah, it's I wrote you. I think it's a really generous text, like giving this well, personal account. I kind of want to ask you actually, how you relate to it in a kind of is it personal for you, the way that when reading one of your latest book, Reverse Cowgirl, I got it is also very deeply personal. Also the letter exchange with Kathy Acker, for example, they're very deeply personal, and at the same time I wonder how you relate to your own story, as it being yours, or is it starting to become something else when you share it? Yeah, just... Oh, you're muted.
I'm from that era that was very skeptical of the idea of, like some inner truth of the self or something, and skeptical also of the confessional as a mode that reveals an otherwise hidden truth. I'm just really not interested in any of those ways of thinking. And I read Irving Goffman at an impressionable age, which is sort of all about how we perform ourselves through frames in our everyday life. And when those frames change, whoever we are actually changes as well. And so if you imagine telling the same story about something that really happened to your best girlfriend, and then telling it to a parent, and then telling it to the cops, you become someone different. Even if it's word for word pretty much the same, you become someone different in the way you would tell that. So yeah, I'm not very interested in the personal in that sense. And there's a way that why do we think of things like sexuality or drug use as personal? Like maybe like they're really general, right? Like, not all, but most humans have sex, and I think pretty much all humans are on drugs of some kind or another, if you understand that very widely. So I think it's more like, how do we think through these sort of abstract forces as passing through the everyday, and writing about that, rather than having a writing that kind of stops short at showing the sort of abstract forces of the world, stopping short at some inner essence, as if that was still there or had ever been there.
Yeah. It seems like you are also questioning in parts if this category of the being human, that still really works.
Yeah, it's the human as a question. Yeah, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be particular kinds? There's now a whole literature of memoir by trans women, but there's certain things that doesn't do, and things that didn't make available to me. So part of it, there's a sort of more specialized thing going on in Reverse Cowgirl, in particular, of sort of opening up, oh, there's sort of like other stories of how we come to be, and then I think we're also ready for a little bit of sort of autocritical thinking about how memoir's connected to how you process transition as a thing that you do for yourself, but also how you're obliged to perform your autobiography for the world over and over again when you transition. So we question why we came at that, you know. Like nobody asks cis people, like, when did you figure your gender out? You know, like no one asks. It's just a given that it's a given, and not something you had to work through. And of course, we all had embarrassing puberties or first puberties where we worked all that stuff out. But at a certain point, you just don't even mention it anymore and don't share those photographs and pretend like it never happened.
Well, there's also this, like in this little piece you shared, there's this notion of, I mean, it's a really complex situation, basically. You are almost LARPing a LARPer, so to say. You're role-playing a role player. So you are a woman, but you're playing a man playing a woman to others because other people see you this way. And I wonder if you can say more about that, this sort of simultaneous worlds almost, that the different layers and how you navigate through those. Or
yeah, it's sort of, and this is just how I navigate these things. It's not other trans people this might not work, and might not be how they want to think. But yes, like there's everyday interactions where I'm like, I get it. I'm a man to you, and I can't change my mind about that. But can I be a man playing at being a woman, where you will then actually produce the interactions, which are the ones that I would like if you treated me as I saw myself. So yeah, like that involves play, and then I have to lean into, you know, sort of like cliche femininity, you know. And trans women in particular are often criticized for doing cliche femininity, but it's actually the way you get the result that you need out of people. You know, people stop treating you as threatening or whatever, and just like, oh, if you're playing at being a girl, I'll treat you the way I treat all girls, which is to ignore you or not take you seriously or not think you're a threat. So yeah, there's like a little nuance to that, in the difference between, I know who I am and I don't care what anybody else thinks. But then sometimes, you know, you still have to act in certain ways. And of course, this is not unique to transness. There are a lot of people who experience forms of, you know, being slightly askance, however the world imagines they should be, and having to perform themselves. Not up to me to make the analogies, I think, but you could see this in a way that's generalizable.
I want to maybe continue in the set of a role play as well, a strategy in a way, role play as a way to escape your body, or to arrive in your body, or also as a way of survival. I don't know how you would see it, and maybe this is also a moment that maybe after Omsk can jump in and explain how real gameplay differs from roleplay. But yeah, this is to both of you.
Yeah, and there's boundaries, you know, like fuzzy borders as to what's game and what's game like. and in game theory, I was interested in whether it became a generalizable language, how we were starting to be obliged to perform all our interactions was in things that were game-like. There's something specific, though, to the performance of femininity for anybody, regardless of how you're embodied to start with. And that's in that psychoanalytic literature about Femininity Is Masquerade, performed so men don't feel threatened. That's, you know, if you're a feminine person, you have to kind of like perform your non-threateningness through a series of you know, like costumes and gestures and you know, physical poses and so on. So there's a way in which the play is not unique to transness at all, but it is unique to femininity in a certain way.
I think it's super interesting to think about these like archetypal roles of like femininity as like a sort of stewardship in a way, like how to transition from one place to the other. And I'm just trying to get my head into this moment, because in a way, this idea of taking the steward would be actually the being non-human in a way, the femininity actually being like fluid and mutable, and using this as a modus of surviving or existing, but then also radicalizing that in order to try to glitch or in a way repurpose what even is femininity. And how does that actually create like a kind of, how do we in a sense create like a sort of radical friendship with this steward of femininity that doesn't replay the historical notions of becoming unseen or unthreatening? It's like really quite a Rubik's. I mean, I think that, I don't know, McKenzie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question here about where is one safe to do what? So there's a way in which for trans women, safety is sort of like there's an extra dimension to that. There's a question of safety for all women, really, or anybody marked as feminine. But there are sort of particular boundaries around that. And I think one needs to distinguish when is one performing femininity in ways that maximize the possibility of safety. So passing is the obvious example of that. You're undetectable as trans. You're just another woman on the street. So you attract a certain attention, but you don't attract that special extra attention that marks you out as more disposable. So that's kind of important. But I think one has to sort of make that caveat, then sort of asking, oh, well, where's the space where you can actually play? And where's the more game-like universe where the stakes aren't physical harm, where you could go, oh, okay, but like, it's absurd. All right, so also maybe you need to really lean into femininity because you're dysphoric about yourself and you need that, and I totally get that. But that's not all trans people either. So I think it's kind of more interesting than to think about like the third space of like, like there are these like really butch trans women I know who like bodybuild and stuff, and I'm like, that's awesome. And you're kind of like no longer anything classifiable. What in the 90s was more like gender fuck, but where I think in 2020s, hopefully we can do it with a little more subtlety and without necessarily feeling like everything has to be transgressive, but more kind of experimental field of gendered practices that we could all participate in.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting part that maybe could also, I feel like could also be interesting to think about proposition of these like beyond the trans identity as well. I mean, I found it super interesting when you said about like, when do cis people decide that they are cis? You know, what moment does that like become, let's say, cast in their mind? And I mean, also within Omsk, I think that we're constantly trying to kind of shake this moment of people where they assume that they have like a shell in a way. And like, actually what happens if you decide that you want to transition into something else or move into something else, and why is this not like actually a practice that we feel comfortable within? Because I think that it becomes also sometimes a little overwhelming, but when we really think about who we are as an identity and all the kind of construct of that, mostly also built on this idea of memory, because of course, like the self is this build up of memory. And what does it do to unturn those memories? And I think this is also quite interesting in relation to the general practice of, for example, drug taking, or it can even be something as like dancing, you know, when you shake those vibrations and you begin to move like your mind from your flesh, from your environment. I mean, I think also the digital is being made like this super accelerated moment of like understanding the body and identity and aesthetics. And I wonder whether maybe to really begin to make changes in the discourse of, I mean, maybe like also undoing gender in a way, whereas, or some like a subject matter of, I mean, I personally find it really hard to even fathom why people understand two genders. I mean, I think I maybe even find it very hard to understand gender as an entity, because I feel like gender is like a multitude of entities. And I think that that's typical for so many cases of what we identify with. And like, how does this kind of lucid complexity, without experiencing or acknowledging that, I feel like a bit like we're really not doing justice to the way in which we could live together.
Yeah, there's a little ambiguity in the notion of gender abolition, and where I think the most helpful way to think it is the abolition of both compulsory binary gender and the abolition of a hierarchy between them.
Yeah, totally.
But where that would then leave you the space to be, you know what, if you want to be a recognizable gender and that's who you are and you're comfortable with it, then have at it. Like there's a way in which gender abolition can also be read as compulsory non-binariness. That's really not helpful to trans people at all, and tips into a sort of a transphobic trope as well. So I think there's a way that one has to be a little subtle about that. And encourage people into that space. And there are ways you can think of the spaces for this as having game-like qualities. So, you know what, you could play with that. You could play with what you sort of unthinkingly just sort of do with gender and see where it goes. So yeah, do drag, cross-dress, see what happens, you know. Change the set of your shoulders, change, you know, how assertive you are in a conversation and see what happens, you know. So I think that's really kind of helpful to sort of open that up and give people that space. And then a lot of people will feel a lot more comfortable with a little more room to maneuver, but then without going so far as, well, then you have to abandon, you know, sort of recognizable modes of gender for, you know, some non-binary future or something. It's like there's a different kind of compulsion that sometimes creeps into that conversation. But yeah, I'm interested in where one gets to play with those things. In the United States, Halloween is a thing where you get to wear fancy dress out on the street for one night, and there's like no end of trans people who are like, you know, cross-dressed for that, and like, wait, I just feel so much better like this. Can I do this all the time? Like, then, you know. So it's sort of like this, you know, unstructured, uncontrolled game environment that can also go horribly wrong. But yeah, like what if we opened up that space a little more intentionally, where these were things that were available for play, but where I think, for me, I think, you know, like nonviolence is a condition for play, that those things go together. So how do you open those spaces so that people can find themselves in a gendered language and modify it, you know, and add to it and change it?
Yeah, I guess they're quite answers to a question that I saw in the chat. Maybe I'll still say it. It was by Evan Turner, who is actually talking about a number of queer LARPs, such as Just a Little Lovin' now, that have helped many LARPers discover their own identities and transition. And he asks if LARPing can help facilitate transition.
Why not? I think that's a fabulous idea, and yeah, like open the you know, the condition of nonviolence where you know there isn't sanction for straying, but there are, like, you know, games do have constraints, right? And boundaries and things like that. So you would sort of run up against those, but where you don't have to worry about getting punched in the face. I think that's like really helpful. And like, why don't we teach that in school? I think that would be like, it's kind of awesome. You just sort of like have this space where you can go, oh wait, like what happens if I do this? Yeah. I'm reminded of the drag king workshops of the 80s, which for a lot of cis women was just like, oh, I get it now. Like you might not want to. It doesn't mean you're going to transition. It doesn't mean you're going to adopt any masculinity at all. But it's just like, oh, that's what it is. Like it's that set of gestures. It's walking down the street like that. Like there's sort of knowledge in that, even if it doesn't shift where you are. So I think it's useful both for people who might possibly transition, but also for people who just want to know the boundaries of what it is that they do. Because like we're constantly taught gender from before you even have language. Like the doctor holds you up, sees your bits and decides you're this gender or that one, and you have no choice in it whatsoever. And then that's reinforced over and over. It's like, how do you get a kind of critical knowledge of that other than by, you know, playing with your body, but hopefully in a place, you know, free from violence? I think that's the really key thing here.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think that it could be potentially very useful as well as like, I think about empathetic exercises where I mean, quite a number of prisons are using alternative LARP therapy in order to, for prisoners who have committed, actually they're mostly using it on sexual abuse crimes, where they actually have to role play being the victim and to experience that kind of 360 of what it means and to be on the other side of it, but like in a safe, controlled space where they also debrief after it and talk to each other, like both the person who is playing the victim and also the abusive person. And I think that's also maybe some of the strong potentials of like role play, especially if you bring them into maybe like less nuanced spaces in society, like a schooling system, you know, where actually you can participate in these immersive spaces, but then also be able to speak together about the experience after. And I would say that I think personally that's really important, to be able to connect and also say the things that you didn't know or that you couldn't work out why you felt that way. And sometimes those questions are not actually answerable, but sometimes just saying them aloud, I think, actually then begins to make a kind of structure of recognition of like, what do you understand in this consensual reality and what do you not? And I think that this all becomes like really practical tools in order to basically maybe even rupture what we know as consensual reality in our day-to-day lives. And like some of those things, like you also want to change. And like maybe by having a kind of method kit of role play, like actually you can change things in your everyday life. I mean, I definitely do this quite often. I actually sometimes summon past characters that have empowered me in order to get through situations where I feel weak. And so I think, yeah, these are sort of not only gaming structures, but they also can be like really helpful mechanics to live more of the life that you want to.
Yeah, I don't know if it took off in other parts of the world, but here in the United States, sort of Dungeons and Dragons culture went completely mainstream. There's like so many sort of Zoomer age kids do that. And that's one of the resources that it provides, where the characters that you've been are things that you can then, you've sort of role played that situation, and then you can sort of take that back into everyday life in sort of structured ways. So it's not necessarily role play as an art form, but it's this vernacular everyday version that, yeah, it's really kind of delightful to see. And it's much lower stakes than the prison example, but I was just like, I'd love to like role play with cis allies where we get to change roles, and the trans people all pretend to be cis, and then we'll just say all the stuff that our allies say to us, like, welcome to womanhood, you're still doing your makeup wrong, you're so brave, and then just refer to these women as he a few times. And yeah, it'd just be like fun to like flip it and see how that goes down. I'm like, oh yeah, when you hear it from the other side, it's maybe those things maybe aren't so great.
Yeah, it's also, I think, funny how like quite a lot of people think that Dungeons and Dragons also like birthed the whole pagan revival movement as well. So I think there's like a whole spectrum of narratives that come across when you feel like you fit inside something.
Yeah, it's kind of great, and there can be a banal level to that as everyday culture, but I think there's a way that makes possible, and sort of refinement of it as a set of practices.
Yeah, what came sort of through and up in between these discussions now of roleplay and how that is enabling in different ways, in either stepping in someone's shoes or in experiencing something yourself that you're not sure about yet, or so the moment when it actually starts to cross over from this fictive safe space to reality, or to whatever we call reality, is, I guess, the moment we would call bleed. And yeah, I was just wondering, Omsk, if you could maybe say a bit of your notion of bleed, of your strategy with bleed, also maybe of the tools, how to deal with it, because it's of course not as easy. It's also messy, as you said. But then also, McKenzie, I would love to hear you as well, because you also mentioned it in your talk and what it means to you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So basically, maybe I just start by the kind of changes between like LARP and what we do, which is called real gameplay. So basically LARP is like live action role play. And this is when the participants like physically act out their characters' actions. And that's normally from a game master. So actually it's like fairly sort of small perimeters of what can happen to this character, because like the character has been written in connection to all the other characters in the story and the narrative. So actually there's not too much space to go off course, or to also play from the fundamental interest of the individual player. So we were very inspired by the whole process of LARP, but we were also kind of more inspired by like what happens when actually the narrative is built by the collection of people that are in the room at that time, that they also can build onto their characters spaces of their own interest and their own need to explore. And so we kind of fused together our own upbringings, which were mostly coming out of like the UK rave scene and free party scenes, where there's also quite a lot of role playing going on, and definitely a kind of cosmos that only exists inside this rave space. And so we kind of mutated this with LARP, and we called it real gameplay. And it's sort of, in a way, mixing this combination of your own narrative with, which is like your own identity, your own lived experiences, and then putting that into the meta structure of the character as you work through the game in space. And that's also, for us, it became also pretty important to work with quite long durations. So we work typically for like 72 hours at a time. So people are also like staying within the space, they sleep there, they eat there. With the longest one with it was 58 days nonstop. And in a way, why we wanted to do this type of work was kind of to reappropriate life in a way, and sort of go beyond this standard state of perception that's commonly based on like cognitive emotions and experiences, and like try to understand lucidity as a kind of direct action. In a way, this reappropriating was sort of for us about the human mind being disrupted and brought into kind of like a state of the uncanny, which enabled it to like hack its common nodes of perception and thought identity. A lot of the people within Social Club also come from the digital era. So this is like, we also quite sit within the frame of like digital language and understanding the digital proxy and technology as a body, but then also trying to basically use role play as maybe one would use an avatar as well, which also then makes this kind of consensual commitment to each other in the group through this narrative. So in a way, we really wanted to sort of work with this as like a political resistance of remapping in a sense. And in a way, it was theory, but also it was play. And in a sense, it was something else. Because of course, like theory has this simple role of, well, not simple, but to make itself understood. And fiction does not, but fiction is this kind of apparatus needed before theory can be set out, because one needs to have the fiction and the ideas in order to make the theological argument in a way. So we were basically trying to create Genesis states where maybe new fictions and new theories and new ways of understanding reality could be permeated. And for us, in relation to why people are quite afraid of bleed in the LARP scene is, and I mean, I can only speak from the times that I've been party to these conversations in the LARP scene at different conferences and so forth. So, and there's also a multitude of opinions on it. But what I seem to understand was that bleed is quite problematic in the LARP scene because there is not the same tools that are available to work things out afterwards. Like a lot of the debrief spaces in traditional LARPs are very much about talking about like your character and your game. Whereas like for us, the debriefs are always about like, okay, what came up in like a socio-emotional political positioning for you alongside your character. And this is more encouraged in our debriefing sessions rather than like speaking about what mechanics occurred. And I think also, to be quite blunt, to discourage bleed doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And if you don't acknowledge something happening, I think then you are also doing an injustice by that. Because we can all get wrapped up in role playing, sometimes to an extremely beneficial effect, and other times we can really torture ourselves.
I love this. It really seems like the next necessary evolution of a certain set of practices. And and forms. And I so agree about the bleed thing. I'm very, very skeptical about fiction and whether things ever actually are. You know, we're raised to question whether things can ever be real, but there's a way in which things are never really fictional. That the sort of made up fantasy element of it is, it's really very fucking real. It's what makes you think you got out of the world. Of course, the world bled into that, you know. But I wanted to ask you about the origins and connection to rave culture, because I was like a 90s raver and I went back to it, you know, like not that long ago. And like, why did I ever leave? I love them. I can sort of intuit the connection, but I'd love it if you could explain how one connects to the other and what one takes from the other.
Yeah, I mean, basically so the first piece that we ever did was, because we thought, okay, we're trying to create this artwork, and we're trying to create this world, but like in physical space. We're not coding it in Unity or something like this. We're actually trying to make it happen. And so the first work that we did was we went back to the place we knew the best. And so we actually put on an illegal rave with a crew in Zurich called Kashev. And we basically spoke to people over 4 generations. So the youngest was putting on raves in the 80s, and sorry, the other way around. The oldest was putting on raves in the 80s, and the youngest people that we spoke to were still putting on raves now. And we actually took a lot of interviews from people over these 40 years. And we didn't interview them about like the history of rave, but actually about their nostalgic memories or their emotions or their politics at that time. We collected all of this together and added in the contemporary politics at that time, which was actually just leading up to the G20 in Hamburg. Amongst a few other things, there was like a huge survivalist theory thread that was running through that point. And we then birthed out of that 400 characters, and people could basically sign up for a character over email, and then they were given the address via an SMS text that was untraceable at 10 o'clock. And then the rave started at 12 out in the forests, and basically lasted till like 8 a.m. And what was really fabulous for us was basically to see all of these characters that glitched. Like we knew what raves were. We knew that who and what characters get played at raves. But we'd added in like uncanny parts to these characters. And also one of the other things that was pretty amazing was that because it was put on as a rave, also a lot of people then started passing this text who didn't actually know that it was being role played at like, 3, 4 in the morning. So then other people were coming who were not in role play. And we had like this free bar open, and they were like, yeah, but where's all the drugs? And of course there wasn't any drugs, because that was like actually our intention to hold it to this artwork space. And then we were like, we don't have any, don't know any dealers here. And then they were like, yeah, but look at this person. And I actually had been in the workshop with them, and they were like this complete speed demon. And they were just role playing this like complete crazy euphoria. And this was like, what became super interesting to us was like, how do you, instead of making a space that doesn't exist, how do you bring in things to spaces that already exist? And this for us became really the kind of lineage of like presenting the world as mutable, because it was like, okay, this looks and feels like everything you think, but then all of these quite strange conversations are occurring over the bar about liminality, or how identity is constructed and so forth. And this was really basically how we started with these raves, because also for us, raves were like a place of solace. Like, I mean, we were pretty working class, like not, I mean, the whole view of art at that point for me when I was growing up, like didn't really exist. The strongish culture was music. And so this was like really where to find something that seemed to be free. And I think also for us, the structure of rave is about also allowing, and I mean, like rave culture has very, very dark points. It's definitely not euphoric, but there's also something like pretty liberating about allowing emotions to be let go of. Like that, you know, ultimate like happiness can be met with the same as sadness. And like nobody's judging you, nobody's like not allowing you to kind of burst out of your body, as long as you do it within like a safe place where you're only damaging yourself. And sometimes I think we do have to damage ourselves. It's not always about and enlightening ourselves, because I mean, yeah, the world is the way that the world is. And so I think this was also something that was really emblematic of what we wanted to try to do, was to, and also when you're in rave life, you're committed, you know, like it's not like you can go to a rave for like 1 or 2 hours and just dip in, dip out. No. Like you are there, and you know, everything becomes part of surviving together. You know, how do you get that glass of water? How many cigarettes are left? Like, oh, like you want to go to the toilet, but then like you don't want to like lose your friend. So it's like becomes this whole joint effort of like just surviving and like keeping inside the rave space. And I think that's a very long explanation, but there's like so many kind of reasons why that.
I mean, I love this. It's also true, and yes, it's a 40-year-old culture now, right? It's just such this spine, and it's an avant-garde that's popular, that gets outside of the constraints and boundaries of, you know, the art world and whatever. Yeah, it's all true. Yeah, and I found it's when I was transitioning, I was like talking to my trans mom about, you know, like the times I felt best in my body before I transitioned was at raves. And particularly techno, because there's something alien about techno as a beat that really just makes anybody conform to it, and nobody is really particularly comfortable in until it is, you know, until you give yourself over to it. And my trans mom was like, oh, there's like a really good queer rave this weekend, why don't you come? And I'm like, oh, I remember all this has all of those qualities. But you're right, it's not utopia, right? It's not all wonderful, but yeah, it is this space where just sort of like just the everyday activities are then suddenly charged with, I gotta hydrate, I have to not lose my friends, that guy over there I really don't trust, so I'm going over this side. But fortunately, if you're in the right one, that guy's rare, you know. Yeah, so I love that you kind of built a practice out of this, because it sort of so needs it, and there's a way in which it kind of gets stuck sometimes, and you need to sort of find ways that you can build out of that.
Totally.
Yeah, just, I mean, there was so much said, but I think that it is maybe a good moment to ask the question of Grace Turtle. Does auto-ethnography play a role in the way you use real gameplay? I mean, yeah, I guess this is for Omsk. You were talking about.
What is auto-ethnography?
Well,
I can Google it. Like, 1 second.
I can explain that if you want. At least how I understand it is, if ethnography is an immersive kind of field work where you've gone somewhere else and you're trying to sort of grasp the patterns of the people around you by interacting with them, then auto-ethnography is you then write yourself into the story in a way that anthropologists don't do. Anthropologists sort of act a bit like they're not there traditionally, or not, you know. So yeah, what's a sort of ethnography of my own actions, like what's the sort of matrix of social relations, and how do what's their symbolic register and all that. But yeah, maybe it's not part of the practice for Omsk.
Yeah, I mean, okay, now I think I get it. Now I'm also getting a definition. Like, I don't know.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. Huh?
No, sorry. I just saw it's there.
I mean, yes. So basically, I mean, this auto-ethnography could also, I guess, maybe be like an argument for using bleed as like a space of explanation. Exploration. There we go. And in a sense, I think also the debrief maybe could be really important to this, like of understanding, yes, you write. So basically, I maybe want to talk about this through an example instead. So we were once asked to do a workshop with a group of teenagers. And after this workshop, we were like doing our debrief, and a lot of them actually said that because I think also teenagers can be quite candid when they want to be, like especially if you sort of build this space of trust for them, because I think they don't necessarily have like all our hang-ups, even though they kind of do on the skin surface, but they're not like so rooted deeply down. And what was really interesting was that we had a really long debrief, like almost 4 hours together. And what they said was that it started very surface. They were like just talking about like how the story had gone and so forth. And then they started talking a lot about, because they'd written their own characters. And then they talked about how the characters were like metaphors for actually their own lives. So they started talking about like parents, or like how their space, for example, one of them that I really also took a real liking to as well, because they were not really super into this idea of role playing at all. And they'd unfortunately had actually experienced in their personal life being a refugee in 3 different places. And they were finally then in Germany at this point. And their character actually had double bluffed themselves in the piece. So the character they'd originally wrote was never in the piece, because the character was actually performing other characters in order to survive inside the space of the world that we'd made. And actually he then came out and basically told the class his like whole personal history of how he'd always felt that he had to, in a way, be somebody else in order to fit in. And so I think in that way, actually, maybe he'd used this term auto-ethnography in order to potentially maybe tell his classmates, you know, there's all sorts, it doesn't have to be that something specifically therapeutic had occurred to him during that role play. Maybe it was just that he wanted to tell his peers that, hey, actually, you know what, like, I am this kind of like grumpy, robust teenager, but really, that's not really me. I've just had kind of a crap hand dealt to me. And this is why I am like the person I am with you all. And I think that actually after I spoke to their tutor some months after, and she said that that class had actually very strongly bonded together after that, because maybe like a few things of their lives had become apparent in the exchange. So I think maybe this is like a way, and sometimes of course you don't have to say that you performed this. You can also write something into your character that only you knows that you're working through it. It doesn't always have to be about like naming it. I don't know if that answered the question so much, but hopefully Beckett.
bit of a transition from auto-ethnography. I still wanted to ask you, McKenzie, about autofiction.
Yeah, and I kind of the prefix auto sort of fascinates me a little bit, and I want to. Hey, can somebody like Google the etymology of auto while we're talking? Because it's like interesting to me at the moment. And we connected also to automatic, and then automatic writing and so on. But yeah, there's a way in which reverse Cowgirl is both auto-fiction and auto-theory in a way. And auto-fiction, the sort of usual definition of that is it's fiction, but of a self that's actual. So the writer puts their real name in the text, but makes no claim that the stories are actually true. And so I do, and reverse Cowgirl does that. It sort of undermines that. Like it says, you know, like the sex all happened, but the rest of it, you know, don't trust me. Like why do we think in memoirs that people actually even know their own story? Like if Freud was right about one thing, it's that we're opaque to ourselves. We don't understand ourselves. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in that as, you know, to what extent are we always sort of fabulating who we imagine we are? Like there isn't kind of a real authentic self that knows, and then one that is sort of supernumerary to that. And then the auto theory is how do you do, you know, production of concepts. That's what I take theory to be, but that's situated, that is not claiming to be the universal abstract unmarked subject. And I wrote books about collective subjectivities. So there's a book about hackers and a book about gamers. But then in reverse Cowgirl, I was kind of like, I want to actually make it a little more specific to a kind of subjectivity that experiences itself through moments of gender euphoria in while fucking, and it's actually, that's generalizable. There's sort of like, you know, categories of people for whom that opens up questions about gender, and for some of us transition, and it's a story that was sort of forbidden. You couldn't transition in the old gender clinic era if you sort of were erotically attracted as a woman to femininity. It was not allowed because they'd be making some lesbian pervert. So no doctor would provide that for you. So no one even acknowledged that it existed. So yeah, it's sort of like opening a space, and I'm not the only writer to do that, but opening a space where the auto is fiction, the stories, I'm not claiming to be revealing, you know, it's not a confession. But then the story opens up towards a concept that's situated for certain kinds of subjectivity that aren't unique to me at all.
Yeah, I think well, we have the auto now, which is
Thank you.
The term is derived from the Greek autos, German self, and the Latin mobile, and was used to distinguish it from the usual land vehicles that were pulled by horses at the time. Yeah,
well, it's the origin of the word automobile, which in the Anglophone world only Americans ever used, and it's a weird word because it yokes a Greek and a Latin root together. But that's English. It's a language, a language with weird, inconsistent rules.
Yeah.
I love etymologies. I love how you can, like, not in the Heideggerian sense of it as the truth of, you know, the word, but as things that you can open up and play with. You know, if you know the history of usage, you can play with it more. But auto is at stake in forms of play and game. Yeah, there's a way that one could put those things together. I was very uncomfortable in any role-playing game before I transitioned, which is super interesting to me. It's a thing I couldn't do before, because maybe I was just doing it all the time.
Well, I was just also, I mean, it's a bit of a jump, but like you were just talking about your auto theory, auto fiction, and that is that, and a big amount of that is about disappearing, also about non-existence, about yeah, the non-self in a way. And so yeah, I thought that was, it's just really interesting
Yeah, and it's Reverse Cowgirl is also a book about transitioning between genders, but transitioning out of being human at all, and the necessity for that and the danger of it. And there's a lot about dancing in that book, but I think that goes in the next one of it was like sex, drugs, and then like raves is actually the safest way to sort of desubjectivize, although obviously it also has its dangers if you push the edge a little bit. Yeah, so there's like so much obsession with identity and stuff that, like I as another, as Rombo said, like why do we want to exist at all? Like why do we want an identity? How do you get out of having one? Seems like a kind of more interesting and parallel question. But Steph has a hand raised to Karina, if you want to.
Oh yeah, Steph.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to throw something in there because I was also like looking up this etymology. I was like, well, if it's like the self, one's own, by oneself, of oneself, which like basically forms the prefix of another thing, then that basically gives like the premise of what it is. And then I was like, but the self is like always like sort of like leaking. It's like not an entity by itself. Like we're all like kind of like all the microbes that run through our body. We are like the people that we interact with every day. We never speak with our own words, but only our way of refashioning other people's words. So I was also thinking like how I was thinking maybe we could like conceive of this new term or concept, which is like actually apofiction, where actually like apo is to like take away. So like basically we just like take away from things that we feel are still like basically our conditions, which is I think also something that we experience a lot when like we're playing, that we are given certain conditions which sometimes we are really fed up with, but then the other person is still playing that. So we have to sort of like find a language in which we can tell them, I'm speaking your language, but I'm also fed up with your language in a way. And which is like how I could, or how I normally also digest the sort of like political potential of real gameplay, in that basically you're always said to have one identity within the gender binary or the nuclear family. And then maybe it's also like you use that binary or the nuclear family as a sort of like shell from which you are actually like just trying to not disengage the shell, but like show that the shell was not all there was forever, and like the change has always been sort of imminent.
I love apofiction. If you want to put your name in the chat, I can credit you with it if I ever use it again. I think I would definitely want to use it, but I definitely want to, let you own it. Yeah, it's really helpful. And like there is this whole, like, it's kind of weird. We got dragged into, thinking very much about identity as there's a way sort of bourgeois liberal commodity culture like needs market segments to address things to. And then we started to process the politics of race and gender and all those things through what's really essentially a kind of bourgeois commodified language, as opposed to doing it through social movements that are collective, so there's that piece to that. And then, there's the bit that you're talking about where it seems like you have a way to be within the structure of the family, within the structure of gender, within the structure of nationalism, you could add too, right? Or a religious structure, give you, like anchors for things. But I kind of, it makes it seem like we exist as singular and that there is one's own. In English, I'm interested in the idea of how one's own and ownership come together. How is, having one's own a way of being an owner? Is it connected to having to think through property and through private property? And how unhelpful is that? And how do you get slippage around those things? Which is why I think it's interesting to move on from the role-played character is completely separate and something that you own. So like, what, there could be bleed between that, just as there's bleed between different subjectivities. Yeah, I mean, how much of my habits have I acquired from partners, sexual or otherwise, or from my friends, and vice versa. That, yeah, we like to think these things are ours, but like none of us invented this language we're speaking, right? Like you just move the words around, like the structure of language is there before us and just gives us a place in it.
Yeah, totally made up of others completely. Yeah, maybe this is also a moment to put in the question of Simona, which also opens kind of a bigger scope. Do you think we humans take everything more intimate, too personal, and lose our connection to our natural being as the other animals, and therefore our freedom? There's a lot to unpack.
Oh, that's great, isn't it? Yeah. To what extent is there there's models of human subjectivity that acknowledge that we belong to something, but then only to the human. Like there's an insistence on the separation of yourself from other selves, and then separation of all those selves together as the human from the world, which is maybe not helpful. That you know, we're already multi-species entities. I can't digest food without the bacteria that's in me, right? If you've ever been on a course of antibiotics, you figure out immediately afterwards, it's like, wait, it's all the bacteria in my gut that do the digesting for me, and the day or two after you can't do it properly. So I'm already more than one thing. You know, I'm already woven into the life of other animals and species, whether it's the dog my roommate owns, or the cats my partner has, or the other species that I eat. Like even if I'm vegan, I'm still eating other things. Yeah. Yeah, so to sort of think through desubjectivization in ways that don't terrify us. Like loss of self can also be terrifying, right? And that's problematic, and you can react back into a very paranoid sense of self, having become terrified about loss of boundaries. So how do you gently slide towards, you know, voluntarily letting go of the sense that I have to be these things and have to be bound this way to my separate human self, to my separation from others or from the world. Yeah, without sort of provoking, and because we're living in a world of fascist reaction to what seems like slippery borders. Yeah. So how do you get people comfortable with unboundedness? And that's where I think play that can bleed is sort of like, seems to me a really encouraging way to think about that and experiment with that.
Yeah, McKenzie, I think you just basically answered the same that I would as well, because I think, yeah, one should not eradicate the self. I think that also I think that's similar to saying that one should eradicate power, because actually, power used in the right way can actually liberate space. It doesn't just have to take away space. So I think that it's really important to keep these models open, because actually they can be useful and creative. But it's when you weaponize them that this is, I think, the thing that we need to lose. And I think also the human has become a weaponization in human-centric ideology. I mean, I think it's very interesting when you even think about, like, I mean, I'm looking at my little dog now sit next to me, and I think, like, well, maybe she just looks at me and thinks animal. I'm the only one who's saying human, like, so I think we also, maybe it's about thinking about what others read us too, in relation to that. Yeah. Do you want to go through there's quite a lot of questions now, I'm noticing, actually. Oh, Karina, you're actually on mute.
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions. Actually, let's start with the last one, maybe, because it ties a bit into what follows a bit the strain. What would be an alternative to ownership property?
Things we're all doing all the time. Like a lot of our relationships are kind of outside property. Yeah. The way I interact with my roommate or my partner or my girlfriend or my kids. like property doesn't really intervene. It's a question of how scalable those other things are. And what's kind of striking about the world of social media is that there's a level in which it's outside property and then one in which it's not. So the whole thing became a way to extract rent out of the fact that we want a space of decommodified communication. So the very desire to be outside property is the thing that got commodified. This is a really weird turn in how commodification works. So like, I don't think there's any mystery about what's outside property. We're outside it all the time. Raves also, like, you know, on a good day or a good night or good morning.
Yeah, and also like these systems of sharing as well, like these are pretty, I think, affirmative of like creating potentially like intergenerational justice systems. Like, you know, it's not, I think, also just about thinking about property or ownership in present tense, but also like from an ancestral space as well. And I think like also maybe like, I don't know, I think evolution is somehow about this collaboration of a coexistence. Like, in a sense, it's like a sort of ecosophical belonging has to be rooted in this social collaboration. Yeah, I think that that's maybe how I would understand what is the alternative would be. Yeah, in a sense, belonging together, like maybe becoming like a traitor of history in a way.
Yeah, this actually works well with the next question. Are either of you familiar with Augusto Boal's theory of the oppressed, and how those techniques compare to LARPing real gameplay in their respective potential to rehearse the revolution?
Wow, that takes me back. Thank you for that reference. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. That's a thing I would have had something to say about 20 years ago, which is the last time I read Bal. But I think to think through what the adjacent lineages are is like really helpful here. Yeah.
Do you want to also say something to this, Omsk, or should I? Oh, I think you're frozen, maybe. Or am I frozen?
In the sense of coexisting. Like there is also, I think, maybe in relation to lab or like real gameplay, in you always have to be super conscious because like everything that you say has like an immediate effect. So for example, if I just said that, okay, we are now all aliens. Like, do we then all become aliens? What would be the point of us becoming alien? Like, so I think that maybe this is also about like checking what we drop into this world. And maybe that does maybe require a certain rethinking of like the voice, let's say, or timing, like, and maybe also it's of course sometimes great to be able to vomit oneself up into a space, which I think also relating back to like rave space, you know, this is perfect. The dance floor is perfect for vomiting oneself up, but not always in a literal sense. But like I think the act of dancing and following beats does this. But then there's also certain moments where your vomiting can, even if it's meant with the best of intentions, cause totally detrimental effects because one did not watch where it flows. So I think maybe in relation to the theater of the oppressed, I think maybe that could be like a kind of takeaway of like understanding that everything we put out has a cause and effect as well as a call and response. And maybe we're just not, I'm rambling now. Oh my God, I'm rambling about the fact that I'm saying that everything has a call and response and one should reflect, and I'm rambling. So I'm gonna stop now and take my own words.
Thank you. I'll go with the next one. Thank you, everyone. It's really nice questions. So I see parallels between RPG and family constellation therapy, especially in the example of the prison empathy therapy sessions. Also, the process of debriefing mirrors the act of integration after a shamanic psychotropic experience. Have you experienced with RPG involving non-human entities as the consciousness to be performed?
So for just firstly, it may mirror certain therapy techniques, but I do have to say that none of us are therapists in the traditional sense of the word, nor do we have any kind of practical ways to hold that. But I would say instead that I think that these are also part of radical care that is communal and is decentralized. And I mean, in relation to the integration of mirroring and debriefing, I mean, actually, we did do a piece last summer where we actually used LSD in a controlled formation. And it was actually just like the core group of Omsk. And we actually took LSD to try to role play it, the understanding of LSD as a primal technology and how that would iterate us into understanding the potential and also the oppression of technology and reality systems today. So we have used experiments in this way. And I think that's also very much about a lot of where our practice is leading us, is also about experimenting and trying to kind of puncture this reality, which of course is used in the shamanic process of journeying. Of course, shamanic processes often believe that there's multiple tunnels within reality and threads and pathways. And in a way, I would say that we believe this too, because I think there is not one reality. I mean, we are all in different spaces as we are now, even though we're listening to the same thing, we're sitting in front of the same computer, but we all come here with different experiences. So we cannot have a cookie cutter sense of an environment, you know, whether you like haven't eaten dinner, you know, that's affecting how you're listening to us, or whether, you know, you want to write a question, but you can't quite, you know, work out how to phrase it. Or maybe I answered a question that kind of pissed you off, my answer. And, you know, so there's all of these like subcategories that are constantly affecting even the way that we look out of these peepers, you know? So we might all be looking at the same thing, but we're all seeing very, very different things. And I would say even just that is a simple argument that there is not one world. And also, who has even the authority to make reality? Like, surely we all do, right? But there's been like a strong passage of time where certain people have taken up the role to make reality. And often, in doing so, have actually told others that they are not in control of authoring or creating reality. And I think maybe in a way, one notices, especially like within more, I guess, like earth-based practices, whether that be occultism, whether that be experimentation with drugs, or the belief in shamanic principles, I think that this is very strongly about care in opening new realities, but often not dictating what is seen, and not being told like how to translate the symbology of what is being seen. And I think like if any of you can open up space for other people to view. I mean, I think that that should be a strong part of any community and any part of caring for each other. Like you don't want to tell someone how to see.
I'm a big believer in treating all drugs as sacred and not as consumer objects. And they're definitely not for everybody. I have a lot of sober friends, and I really respect that commitment to being in this world with as unmodified an awareness as you can. Like, I respect that and the need for that. But I personally really like drugs and like the extreme desubjectivization of that. But the reintegration is very important with that. Yeah, particularly if you're taking somebody else with it is how you bring somebody back with something back to coming back to the consensus reality we're kind of obliged to share. I think that's really key. I'm always a little nervous about the psi complexes. Psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis have been major oppressors of trans people for over a century and still gatekeep care from me. So as far as I'm concerned, mostly the enemy. So I'm much more interested in what's a kind of aesthetic practice of care of the self. This is later Foucault, yeah. Later Foucault is like, yeah, as a gay man in the mid-20th century, those things are agencies of control. But what are the languages of self-care that are aesthetic about what a self can be? But there are others, and particularly there are other cultures in which to be something like analogous to a trans woman is to be something sacred, yeah, rather than to be something that's psychologically damaged, as we're still mostly considered.
Thank you. I'll just go on with those questions. There's a minute. I was thinking about super hetero, cis refusing to date trans people, or spicy hetero, and how LARPing gender exploration could be also employed against gender liberation. How should we react to this phenomenon?
Oh, that's really interesting. And I was like, that's the thing, is like anything you think you're gonna use as a tool of liberation is reversible and it's going to get used against you. It's just a thing you have to kind of be aware of, right? I'm sure the CIA is doing role play even as we speak about how they're going to invade some country or something. But I'm pretty fine with people not wanting to date, particularly like, cis lesbians who don't want to date trans women. I'm kind of fine with that, because it's like, oh, if you've got those sort of hangups about bodies, you're probably no fun in the sack anyway. Like, why would I be interested? But if you're like, I don't know, I'd explore that. That could be maybe interesting. Then okay, then fine. Yeah. I don't want to impose a obligatory gotta sleep with the trans girls thing on anybody. The reverse is true also. There's like weird fetishizations, that like black girls make a living off that. Yeah. That particularly cis men are kind of obsessed with hot trans women is a living for sisters who I know. Yeah, that's the structure of the world we're in. But it's like, yeah, what would role play be? Oh, actually, the adjacency of role play to sex work is worth a mention, right? Because people I know who do that for a living, like they're acting. It's theater, but you could also say it's role play. Yeah. And there's definitely bleed, and that's the problem with that as a kind of work. Like all work invades the rest of your life. That's a problem with work, but that one invades it in very particular ways, I think.
Totally. I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think also, yeah, I mean, I think that maybe this is a bit of a simple reply, but I think that in a sense, we will never find something that cannot be used against. Like, I don't think that there is ever this pure tool or this pure idea or this pure solution to a problem, because everything can be used in multitude of ways. Like, it depends on the person who holds it. But I think that this is also not a reason to not use it either. I think that maybe one of the interesting ways that you could read through this lens of potential LARPing or gender exploration being used against gender liberation would be, for example, in a debrief scenario about speaking about it afterwards, then, you know, bringing up these critiques, actually then do open space to be able to talk about it. So in a sense, then there is still space given to the discussion. And I think that's maybe also one way to keep fluid. Because I think, like, I personally know that the world will not become livable for all in my lifetime. I know this deeply, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't try to make steps towards making it more livable, and that, you know, I will fail. The ideas that I have will fail, but I think it's part of moving is also failing.
Oh, the other little bit I'd add to that is, like, you sometimes talk to people who will narrate an experience about how, you know, I put on the costume and acted in the other gender, and I just felt horrible about it. Like, I just felt like everything was wrong in my body. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to dysphoria. Like, that's what it's like to be trans. And you know, as a cis person, you got that by crossing a boundary that doesn't work for you. Not everybody can be fluid and free about gender. Like, some people need it to be a certain way. That's dysphoria, when yeah, like, your body is telling you that's not a form of gendered being you can inhabit, and it's real. And the hardest thing to explain about transness to anybody is dysphoria.
All right, I'll go with the next one because I think it fits nicely. Hey, would you be interested to hear, what you think, how roleplay interacts or intersects with politics and ideologies? Things such as LARPing have this implicit political dimension when roles are brought into actual social reality and politics to take part in social reality too. But at the same time, I imagine roleplay or even LARPing creates a space of exploration, an environment where you can distance from your initial presumptions, distance from your identity, and bring it into question, or imagine yourself as the opposite face of the political spectrum. So then, is roleplay effective in only confusing the hegemonic categories, or does it also invent novel forms of politics and ideologies?
I mean, I'm with Louis Althusser, who was saying already in the 60s, you know, there's no outside to ideology. There's no non-ideological. Maybe a science could aspire to that, but even the sciences have never achieved it. And ideology is the sort of structure of language and culture that creates a position in which you can be addressed. And in Althusser's famous example, the cop on the street says, "Hey, you," and everybody thinks they're the one addressed by the you. Like, that's ideology. Like, you feel like it's addressing you, and it makes a space for you to be. What's interesting about role play is it changes that space. Like, it's not outside ideology, but it's a reframing of who the you is within it, so the you can be addressed, you know, at a different point. And that, I think, and again, like any tool, you can do different things with it, probably some of them really bad, but there's a way in which you can make that useful as, like, oh, this is what it feels like to be addressed, where the you that I inhabit on the other side as I is different to the one that I'm used to. You can, first of all, maybe start to understand that structure, that's the structure of being able to inhabit the symbolic, but that also, oh, like, the experience could be different if I was somebody else. This is why people read, you know, good fiction, is to sort of inhabit another subjectivity. Yeah, I read Jane Austen. I'm like, oh wow, it would have been really fucked up and miserable. But these would have been the ways I would strategize if I was a woman of the 18th century, trapped in these little miserable country houses. This is who I would be. But then to sort of take it off the page and into the space where you get to act it is maybe, you know, the next level.
Yeah, I think also that we cannot begin to separate these spaces. We are always inside. And I think that's also an argument for bleed in general, that like you cannot leave you at the door. Like you will always go through the door. Like just how much of you actually often depends quite strongly, I think, on like the group of people in the space as well. Like how safe do you feel to pack up you a little bit further? And I think that that's maybe also, I'm trying to get my head around this question a little bit, I have to say, because so I wonder whether I'm having a trouble because I don't know whether anything has an implicit political dimension. Because a political dimension is in itself extremely emotional and also comes through culture and structure. So like, for example, something that I really agree with politically might make sense to me because of a certain set of perimeters that I find myself within. So I'm not, but that might not make sense to others. I mean, like for me, the idea of a psychotherapy that McKenzie brought up, like, is also a space of kind of fear for me. I don't trust because I also come from, well, firstly, identifying as female. There's a strong history as well of psychology understanding something through the pretense of hysteria, which I think is extremely detrimental to women over the course of history, particularly, but also like not being from a privileged class space, then there's certain attributes that I've grown up with in my life that would maybe be seen as unhealthy ways of explaining oneself. So I think I find it really difficult to not understand politics or ideology as building blocks like on the body. I'm not sure if they can ever be like seen like as like, okay, here is the alt-right, you know, but that doesn't really, I don't know whether, Rojas, do you feel like you could maybe, if I'm not answering this question, could you maybe like respond to me?
Hello. Yeah, I was, maybe I'm not so well spoken to propose this question. And yeah, I realized that I did have this perhaps false dichotomy that I had in my head, and I just and I think asking this question really helped me to like reevaluate these two poles that I had in my head. I think, yeah, maybe that's it. Thanks a lot for the question. I really appreciate. I mean,
thank you.
Yes.
Like, I think it's also, I mean, I do understand we all super slip into binaries sometimes, right? Because we're also taught to think like that. You know, there is certain sections of life. But I think that's also maybe where what I found really interested in the lens of role play is that like quickly everything that you think can become questionable. But thanks anyway for the question, because I think it's always really good to check in on like, yeah, deterministic ideas at times.
Yeah, thank you for all of this. I still wanted to ask one thing to both of you as well, and it's just about. I mean, in a way, it feels almost like a step back because we already established how we're made up of others, and we're in here. Everything is inherently collective endeavor or experience, but practice really have a. I love, for example, McKenzie, how you take other people in your writing. You published 2 books that are just made up of the writing of others, like Sensoria or General Intellect, and even in the other books or like Hacker Manifesto, you also wrote it with other people, and then Omsk. I mean, I would see these real gameplay as collective narrations also. They are made up in the beginning. You cannot follow your one story. You can even have an idea of how you want to play, but then obviously someone will come in and like steal something, or I don't know, do something. And yeah, I just want to hear you maybe talk a bit more about this notion of collectivity or collective writing or collective storytelling or whatever you call it in your work.
It's just simply that I'm a very vain and narcissistic Marxist. So like, how do you square the circle between those things? And it's kind of like, like I want the mic, but then I feel like I have to pass it, I think that's the, that's the tension there.
Yeah, I mean, I think within the context of Omsk, I mean, as me now, I'm just role-playing a steward of a theory of collectivity. There is one of me, but there's actually more of me because I can also see Omsk in this room that's out of my body, but in this room. So I think that in a sense, Omsk is really kind of about creating like decentralized space that is, well, actually can only be performed through the collective. Because, if I am just there being Omsk, role-playing, I mean, nothing really happened apart from in my own head, which I can just daydream. I don't need to call that role-playing. Or and I think that this is, and it's not the way for everybody, but I think it's also just the way that the group of people who are within Omsk and around Omsk, it's a way of like getting through and understanding the potential of brokering new space. And I would say it's there as an art practice, but it's also there as like a survival manual. It's there as a meeting point. It's there as bringing people together with the same questions and sometimes the same answers, but often not. I think most of the time Omsk presents way more questions, which is also, I think, the reason why I personally am so fascinated by the space that it demarcates, is because I never stop learning there. I'm never the teacher because I'm always being taught and I'm always learning at the same time. And so I guess like Omsk was created because there was a need to create it. And that need maybe was collective participation, as perception, as growth.
All right. I think we're coming to a time where it's almost time to wrap up. Maybe I just give it like a small moment if someone still wants to ask any last question, or also if McKenzie, Omsk, if you have something you want to ask to each other or to anyone. This is also a moment. And
only like when do we get to play in the real world? I'd love to do that sometime. So put me on the list.
Definitely, we need to go forward with that, I think. And I also just want to say, like, really like strong appreciation for like everybody in the chat and in the space today, because I think it's like actually being, I know we are on Zoom, but it actually has felt a little bit at times like we weren't. So it's really nice.
all right, I see there's one last question. Okay, let's give it that. Hey, I'm asking, and maybe, oh no, but in the last year, LARP become more in the public discourse, but role-playing also became somehow a propaganda tool for power. For example, in the American election. How would you think about that shift in general?
Politics is always theater, and American politics is just more hyperbolically theatrical because it's like a vast, huge country and huge amounts of money involved. So it seems more theatrical. Everybody's politics is theater essentially. And, you know, of course, you know, politics is forms of acting. I used to know people who in Australia was much more involved in politics, and the people who are good at it are essentially actors. Yeah. They don't make up their lines. They just say them convincingly. And yeah, there is a way in which live action role play is becoming a lot more of a mainstream thing. But I think that's why it's interesting to just sort of see where, as with the example of Omsk, where of experienced practitioners taken it somewhere else and thought about what the next sort of iteration or evolution of those forms are, or it becomes something else. So yeah, I learned a lot from this. It was interesting to see where that's gone, and just sometimes you need somewhere to hide from, you know, like the whatever the dominant culture is doing, you know, like where are the little quiet places we don't have to tell everyone about, you know, where you can actually endure.
Yeah, I think like definitely you're right in bringing this question up, but I would also say that I think that roleplay has always been present in creating new space. I think just maybe now we're like seeing behind the smoke screen of it. And that's, I would say, it's interesting because like when I look back at things that we wrote, like manifestos, you know, 5-6 years ago about why we even wanted to make Omsk, which was actually firstly was the reasoning of why we wanted to make it rather than just making it. And it was really about believing that like role-playing space could actually open space. And I think that maybe that's just become acknowledged, which is also even more reason to hone in one's practices, and especially in a collective vein, because, you know, how do you differentiate when, you know, if there's 20 people role-playing a certain set parameter of reality, when does that become consensual reality? You know, when does it stop becoming a fiction? You know, is a hallucination just like an educational drama, which we can then, you know, actually omit? I think consensual reality, this world that we know at large, is somebody else's role-played game. So let's play another one, huh? I think they had enough time.
Thank you. Yes. Let's play a different one. One's plural. Yes.
Yes. Plural and mutable.
Yes, exactly. Lots of bleed.
And this, I guess,
metaphorical bleed.
And it seems also that there's just a sharpening of tools anyways to understand these kind of subtleties, or like of first of all understanding that we live in different worlds, and then realizing how we can maybe build a communal one and sort of say, or in momentary, of course, momentary ones.
I got to say, when the alt-right invaded the Capitol in DC back in January, I just couldn't help thinking of it as LARPing. I mean, they kind of like LARPed a counter-revolution, you know, and got away with it because the police wouldn't arrest them, even though I think 2 people got killed. So it's kind of like, oh, we need to move on from that frame, and let's practice this in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, like almost like positive conspiracies.
Yeah.
We can make. Yeah. And you had some guided apathy in Hotel Bardo or Omsk. All right, thank you so much. Really, it was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Karina. A pleasure to meet Omsk and learn about it.
Yeah, very much.
Yes, I hope we all meet in future paths physically at some point. Take care of yourself.
Bye for now.
Cheers.
Danke, Karina. Warte.
Oh my God,
Look who's been there all the time.
Schmuck.